Mr. Anderson Skeet, President of the CFA Society Barbados, Dr. Amy Fletcher, writer, futures analyst, and public speaker, Mr. Ryan Ballard, Senior Manager, Climate Change and Sustainability Services, EY, Ms. Eliana Prada, Creative Economy Specialist, Inter-American Development Bank, members of the CFA Society Barbados, industry partners, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Makila Alibox, Secretary of the Board of Directors of CFA Society Barbados, and it's my pleasure to welcome you as your host this morning. On behalf of the CFA Society Barbados, thank you for being here for our 2026 forecast event. This morning is about more than outlooks and projections. It's about perspective. It's about stepping back to examine the shifting forces influencing markets, economies, and the decisions we make as investment professionals. We've assembled an exceptional group of speakers who will share insights, challenge assumptions, and offer fresh ways of thinking about the road ahead. Whether you're here to validate your own views or to be challenged, I'm confident you'll leave with something valuable. So settle in, enjoy the conversation, and let's get started. But before we begin, we'd like to extend sincere thanks to the organizations whose support has helped bring today's forecast event to life. To our gold sponsors, CIBC Caribbean, Sidel Bank and Trust, the National Financial Literacy Program, and EY, and our silver sponsor, Courtesy Garage. We truly appreciate your partnership and commitment to advancing finance, innovation, and thought leadership in Barbados. Now, to set the tone for the day ahead, we begin with a leader who continues to shape and elevate our regional investment community. Please join me in welcoming the President of CFA Society Barbados, Mr. Anderson Skeet.
Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guests, fellow members of the CFA Society Barbados, and friends of our regional financial community, it is my humble honor and privilege to welcome each of you to our 2026 annual forecast event. Let me begin by expressing our sincere gratitude to our vital corporate sponsors who made this gathering possible. CIBC Caribbean, Ernst & Young, the National Financial Literacy Program, Sidel Bank and Trust, and Courtesy Garage. I also want to extend a special thank you to the Hilton Barbados for providing such an exceptional venue for this milestone event. This year, we find ourselves at a fascinating juncture. We have titled our gathering, Finance at the Crossroads, Creativity, Credibility, and Capital. It is a theme that reflects a modern reality. The traditional pillars of our industry are being rapidly reshaped by forces that only a few years ago felt like distant concepts. Today, we move beyond basic numbers on a ledger to address the practical implementation of these macro trends. To help us navigate this landscape, our agenda features three distinguished experts who are actively bridging theory and practice across our core focus areas. First, geopolitics and finance. We will lead off with Dr. Amy Fletcher, a globally recognized futures analyst, author, and premier voice on the social, political, and ethical implications of emerging technology. She will guide us through the legislative frameworks necessary to balance automated finance with human integrity. Sustainability reporting. Next, we welcome Mr. Ryan Ballard, an accomplished international ESG professional and sustainable finance subject matter expert. Drawing on his global experience managing climate strategies and ESG integration with major financial institutions, he will break down how corporate value is now permanently linked to measurable environmental and social impacts. The orange economy. Finally, we are privileged to feature Ms. Eliana Prada, a creative economy specialist with the Competitiveness, Technology, and Innovation Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, bringing over 15 years of experience strengthening creative entrepreneurial ecosystems and backed by specialized public policy and digital transformation credentials from Harvard University. She will outline the structured frameworks needed to unlock private capital for our regional creative sectors. Our goal this morning is simple: to move past the what and lock into the how. How do we remain credible leaders while embracing radical creativity? How do we strategically direct capital toward the sectors defining the Caribbean economy? We have a tightly packed schedule of presentations and lively debate. I encourage you to actively challenge these ideas, network deeply with your peers, and leave here today with a crystal clear vision of where our industry is headed. Thank you all for your presence, and let's get started.
Thank you for that welcome, Anderson. Now, if the past few years have taught us anything, it's that markets don't move in isolation. Geopolitics matters. And in a world defined by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, staying ahead requires more than analysis. It demands foresight. Our next speaker is an expert in exactly that. A political scientist and strategic advisor, she helps organizations make sense of disruption and prepare for what's next. And as you listen, we invite you to be a part of the conversation. So please remember to scan the QR code on your desk and send us your questions at any time for the fireside chat to follow. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Fletcher as she takes us through geopolitics and finance, using foresight to navigate VUCA.
Thank you so much for letting me be here. I really appreciate this. Again, my name is Amy Fletcher, and I'm a foresight analyst and political scientist. And this area is my passion. So we have a lot to talk about in a relatively short amount of time. So I've really tried to distill it to the core things that I think we need to think about in terms of the ethical and legislative framework for agentic AI. So could I ask the audience, how many of you have heard of and are working fairly consistently with generative AI? ChatGPT, Gemini, and the like? Okay. Well, just as soon as we all started to get our minds around generative AI, suddenly agentic AI is on the horizon. And this is where I want to start in terms of disruption and how we need to think about how we bring people into this space. So, very quickly, the four main parts of this presentation. I'm going to do a brief overview of agentic AI. Then, if you're familiar with foresight, you're probably familiar with the fact that we have a lot of acronyms. And VUCA, which has been mentioned, focuses on volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think that's exactly the space that fintech is in at this moment. Then I'm going to suggest some principles for fintech governance, and then do a very brief exploratory scenario exercise, which I hope can be the start of some discussions. These are not necessarily the only scenarios that might play out, but I think they're very important, again, in terms of bringing people into this space. So to set the framework, if you recall, one of the great 1930s political economists was Joseph Schumpeter. And he was writing at a time when the world was on fire. And I think about him a lot lately because I think in some ways our world is as destabilized as his was. Ideas are being tested. Old ways of doing things are under stress. Consensus is breaking down. And writing in the 30s, watching a world that was being engulfed in geopolitical and technological change, Schumpeter came up with the brilliant, I think, term, creative destruction. And I think it's as true today as it was when he was writing. Capitalism can be a wondrous thing. It is mobile, it is generative, it is innovative, it can bring new products, new innovation, create middle classes, allow different people to take their chance. But it is also inherently destructive. Without legislative and ethical guardrails, capitalism is invariably destructive. Things go along sort of the way they have been for quite some time, and then we'll have these sudden waves of disruption, whether they're political or social or technological, and suddenly everything's back in flux. Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? How are we going to ensure that everyone gets a fair opportunity in this highly disruptive space? And just as a quick example of disruption, before we get specifically to fintech, I'm Gen X, and for Gen X, music was albums. Do you remember albums? I loved albums. You'd have to go to the store and buy them, and you'd have a conversation with the clerk, and they usually knew a lot about everything, artists you'd never heard of, and you'd kind of flip through the stacks, and even though you'd come to look for one thing, oh, well, suddenly this looks interesting. What do you think about this? Do you recommend this? And then I don't know if you recall this, but if you were an album person, you brought it home and you took off the shrink wrap and you put it on the turntable and you sat there and listened for 40 or 45 minutes. These albums mattered, whether it was the Beatles or John Coltrane. It was an experience. Well, around 1999, suddenly, though they got in a lot of trouble for it, but they still set the framework. If you'll recall, suddenly we have Napster. And what has happened to music as a result of this disruption? It's not just that my personal learning or listening experience is different, and I still believe in albums. I'm just an album fanatic, but that's kind of gone. You could sort of pick your songs out of the air, and there's a few big stars left, but they're few and far between. And you don't own it anymore. It's not tangible. In a sense, you license it from a company like Spotify. And it changed not just the way we listen to the music, but that disruption changed an entire industry. I know right now that the biopic of Michael Jackson is extraordinarily popular worldwide. And you think, I mean, he was brilliantly talented, but you think about the kind of fame that he had. And that relied more on an analog era and an analog ecosystem. And we were all sort of united if you were a Michael Jackson fan. Whereas now there's so many stars that come through. And it's very difficult to build, however talented you are, that sort of career. So I think in the back of our minds, that's a good way to think about disruption. It's an example that everybody can sort of get their head around. Now, staying with that, okay, so now we're coming back into the fintech space. We just, I'll say it again, just started to get our minds around generative AI, and now we're moving to agentic AI. So what are some of the key differences, and how does this relate to disruption? Everything in the fintech space is in an uproar. There is so much exciting but also destabilizing churn in the fintech space right now because of technology. So generative AI is very good. It's generative because it can create new content. It's been trained on billions of pieces of information that have come before, and it can generate new, some people might want to put scare quotes around that word new, but it can generate content on its own. It can write the report. It can write a short story. It can generate new images based on how it's been trained. It's flexible. To get the best use out of it, you need to be good at what we call prompting, right? Kind of getting into, kind of guiding it to where you need it to go. Relatively low autonomy, though. There are certain tasks it can automate, but it's relatively low in the grand scheme of things. It's built on content, and your big risk in generative AI is bias and hallucinations. And I had a very good example of this that I was showing to a client where I asked about Stella Simpson, the great Hollywood star from the 1920s. There is no Stella Simpson. But the generative AI did this like 4-page biography of this woman who never was. It made up movie titles. It made up her birthplace. It made up whether or not she ever won an Academy Award. I won't mention whose company that particular Gen AI was. That would probably not be a very wise thing to do. But even the best is still fraught with hallucination. If that weren't enough, though, we are now moving into the agentic AI age. And now things are going to speed up considerably. Agentic AI moves you from content to decision-making. This is where, for younger people in particular, but for people across the age demographics, but new entrants, again, particularly, this is where the job churn is going to be the hardest. First of all, no one in our universities, and I used to teach at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and yeah, very good, very thoughtful people there. But as time went on, the ability to predict what jobs were even likely started to go down rapidly. Universities take forever to make a decision still. That is the way that institution is built. But kids are coming out of school today needing work, and the jobs are changing dramatically because agentic AI moves you to actual machine decision-making. The entry-level jobs, the data entry, the input, some of the easier for people that are trained to do it, analyses, the risk management, that whole layer within the next 5 to 10 years is arguably gone. It's the same as for paralegals. The best agentic AI will be able to analyze 300 years of case law and write a report faster than the best human ever could. So the disruption is at the very fundamental level of jobs. It can go 24/7. So we already live in a global 24/7 world. It will simply become more so. And that relates to the bottom point of unintended consequences. Much of what we're going to see with agentic AI, if it has not been programmed to your specific needs as a firm or as an institution or an organization, if it's all in that algorithmic black box and the only people that understand it are the company that sold it to you, the unintended consequences of decisions that you did not mean to make is going to be profound. And in the worst case scenarios, you'll be left with a decision that got taken by a machine and people cannot be accountable for it. So again, this is a worst case scenario, but agentic AI takes an already churned up space, which is Gen AI and finance, and it troubles the waters even further. So we also can optimize our workflows, that's nice, but again, it's got high autonomy. Developing the confidence in anyone at any level of the organization to be able to contest what the machine is saying is going to be crucial. And again, being able to explain it to your stakeholders and your shareholders. And again, I don't know about you, I consider myself, I was a professor and all those sorts of wonderful things, but there's something when you sit with ChatGPT or any of those tools for very long that you do become a bit, oh machine, please tell me what the answer is. And again, there's just something about it that tends to create a dynamic where you feel like you're losing a bit of your expertise or your autonomy. And this is something that we all need to guard against. So, very quickly, I know I'm going to go through these very quickly. These screenshots give you an idea of how disruptive. The media has already latched onto this. I thought, well, my answer to their question was, I just hope not. But it shows you how seriously some are taking agentic AI. Again, this is particularly for entry level, for the kids that have done the work of getting their degrees, and now they're coming out into a world where the link between the effort, the degree, and the job is much weaker than it used to be. And it's nothing that they did. It's that the system is being disrupted. Waiting for geopolitical normal, this brings us back to Schumpeter, and I'll say more about that in a moment, is probably the greatest risk to your strategy. For the last 10 years, I've had this thought, okay, this too shall pass and we'll get back to normal. And I know, no. I mean, well past, speaking as an American, well past the 2028 election, I think normal, that horse left the barn a long time ago. I think we live in an era of continuous upheaval. We have rising populism. We have billionaires seeking to escape that populism. We have a lot of people caught in the middle. And again, all of the ideas are contested. And very quickly, something I used to say to my students, and again, you're welcome to challenge this, I think if we could time travel to this moment, if we could bring 3 people back, and we brought back a diplomat from 1994, 1954, and 1914, I think once the 1914 diplomat got used to the technology and the different kinds of clothes and the like, I think the person from 1914 on the eve of World War I would have understood this moment better. Because 1954, you're locked into the Cold War. Whatever side you're on, everything that happens in technology or geopolitics is Cold War. There's this side, there's that side, move on. In 1994, of course, we had that brief moment of the post-Cold War era, where we thought we'd resolved everything, and capitalism and democracy were going to continue their victorious walk through history. Well, I think in 1914, probably that person again would recognize the kind of churn, the sort of instability. And I'm not necessarily saying there is going to be a World War III. I want to be clear about this. But I do think if you have been feeling stressed lately, there is a reason for it beyond the personal. I think this is a deeply stressful geopolitical time. So that brings us back to, oh, here's one specifically for the Caribbean. That's another risk in this agentic AI world. We've already seen that with certain stock market crashes. It's likely only going to get worse. Once a mistake has been made, the speed of this will be so far beyond what typical legislative or organizational units can monitor that failure and risk begins to cascade through the entire global financial system. The reaction times will be very difficult for any of us to control. All right, so coming back to VUCA, I won't go through all of these. I am happy to share these slides if you would like a copy, if they're useful to you. In terms of volatility in the fintech space, again, I think the geopolitical disruptions are key. Venture capital is all over the place, but it's also incredibly volatile. Everybody's looking for that winner to place their bet on. This creates vulnerabilities for smaller players and smaller countries. We have uncertainty. Consumers, what about consumer uptake? Will they want it? Will they be able to afford it? And if they have it, will they understand it? And I don't mean that as a criticism of any given user, but we do know that financial literacy is extremely important, but quite low among most people. People are being asked to take responsibility for more of their financial decisions, but if they don't have the tools to do that, you're putting people in an incredibly vulnerable position. Complexity, we've got risk spillovers, cross-border compliance issues, disparate fintech literacy, and ambiguity. There, I think, again, in the interest of time, the two I'm going to focus on, deep fakes and risk. Are any of you familiar with the deep fake issue? These sort of incredibly, I fell for something the other day and felt really dumb. And then I got mad that the person that posted it on the feed was using all of us as a test case for his prank. I thought, well, that erodes trust, doesn't it? I'm glad you had your fun. I'll never respond to anything on X again, right? But anybody can be taken in. These are so convincing. So again, my nightmare scenario, to be dramatic, what happens if big leader of big country A is believed to have said they are going to start attacking big country B? How much time do we have to react to that? I mean, people, again, they'll see it, they'll panic. Who knows if it's real? How long does it take to discredit it? Right? How long does it take to get people to understand that their fears are unfounded? All of these things are accelerating under this ambiguity. And again, the speed of disruption, it's even for those of us for whom emerging technologies is our passion, it is just so intense. Every day you think you've mastered something, and then that next thing comes through, that next app. I am so tired of downloading apps. I am so tired of it, and I'm tired of needing my email for everything. I don't remember it sometimes when I'm tired, right? And we now live in a world where that human interface, we're so used to it, we don't question it now. And it probably was necessary because we live in a much faster world than my grandparents, for example, did. But it is exhausting, this constant need to stay current with what the next app, that next thing you've got to buy to stay competitive, that next platform you need to get visibility and the like. So I think, to boil this down, a framework for ethics and governance requires balancing regional integration, innovation, and a people-first approach to digital fintech literacy. And very briefly, I'm going to introduce how I think foresight can be very helpful here. Again, I'm happy to share these slides and to talk at length with anyone who wants to follow up. But in the interest of time and the other presenters, I will be going through this relatively quickly. But a foresight lens is what allows stakeholders to move beyond reaction, simply reacting to what the big tech firms or the big players are doing, and be able to take a breath for a second, not too long, we live in a fast world, but take a breath and look again at what you want to be driving your fintech strategy. So we don't need any more acronyms in foresight, but I made one up, and it's TIRA. The 4 pillars, I believe, of an ethical framework for legislation and governance of fintech and agentic AI is built on these 4 pillars. Transparency. We have to rebuild and maintain trust in a post-truth era. Companies, again, back to creative destruction. I am not making a value judgment, but they have no interest in letting you know what's in the black box of that algorithm. If you don't know, or your company did not have input for your specific use case, then your ability to explain a situation to a stockholder, a shareholder, some small finance client for whom their money is extremely important, even though it doesn't seem like a lot, perhaps, to some of the big global firms. All of that goes down. And we're increasingly seeing this in the job market as well. We were told, I can find it if I need to, we were told that algorithms would make job searches less biased. Everything would be done by the machine. It's math. No. It actually, if you have a bad actor, can hide bias and discrimination. You can input variables into your algorithm that make it almost impossible for the person who feels they have been harmed to even ask the questions they need to ask, let alone understand why this particular financial investment decision was made, this whether I got the job or not. So opening up that algorithmic black box, we don't all have to be computer programmers, but we do need to demand transparency around what is that equation doing, what outcomes is it driving the model to have. Inclusion, again, to me, there's no point in all of this technological disruption if it simply keeps the status quo, privileges the few, disadvantages the many. So inclusion, we could talk about at length. Resilience. How can smaller players, and this was a big question when I was in New Zealand, they are so ethical, they are a free trade country, they play by the rules, they believe in the international organizations, and it is a constant struggle to maintain that position in this world of raw, big power politics. So how do you ensure that your values are what is driving this, not external actors in some global big nation-state space? And finally, anticipation. I was very interested to see, I would love to hear more about this. My understanding is that the Central Bank of Barbados is doing a lot of interesting work with these regional and technological sandboxes. I think there needs to be more of that, and I think it needs to scale out as best practice to other countries in the region. Small experiments with good guardrails. Try them out before everybody's invested, before everybody's gone down that path. Get your ethical principles in place, and then let a case study see if you get the outcome that you want from this technology. And my last slide, which I'll go through quite quickly, but again, I'm happy to elaborate on. So once we've looked at VUCA, and once we've thought about our principles for governance, one thing that I find very helpful about foresight, it is not about predicting the future like a fortune teller would. I don't know what's going to happen 3 days from now. And if I told you I knew exactly, I would not be being truthful with you. Foresight is about anticipating potential futures and looking at how different variables could come together to shape possibilities. And if you find there's a scenario that is more appealing than another, you can start reverse engineering to think about, okay, how do we get to that place, not this place? So the two uncertainties that I've used for these exploratory scenarios that I'm happy to share are countries go it alone versus regional integration in the Caribbean. And the other uncertainty on the horizontal axis is that digital literacy rates remain comparatively low. Best case scenario, we have universal digital literacy. It is built into every aspect of the education system. And when you put those two uncertainties together, those two drivers, against the context of the disruption, agentic AI, and VUCA. Regional integration with low digital literacy, I've called this scenario temporarily father knows best. It's very paternalistic. One might be able to protect the region's interests, but the inclusion variable stays relatively low. Your nightmare scenario, of course, is that bottom quadrant, low digital literacy and countries go it alone. This is where the big interests can simply pick off different countries, set them against each other, sell them technologies that they don't necessarily need just because they sound flashy or important. Winner takes all is countries go it alone and you've got universal digital literacy. So there would be some benefits to this scenario, particularly in terms of training people for the global fintech job market. But again, there's competition and a sort of winner takes all mentality built into it. I think the ideal scenario out to 2040 is the combination of regional integration and a push towards universal digital fintech literacy. And I call that one agentic archipelago. What you have is a region that is now integrated. It is strong because it is cooperating. It is being driven by Caribbean values. Yes, it is competing in a global market, but it is concerned that these algorithms and these technologies are placed within a framework that is inclusive and transparent and value-driven. So again, it was a lot to talk about in 27 minutes, but I know we have other presenters, so I want to stop there. But again, I would love to talk to anyone who's been interested in these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy, for that insightful presentation and sharing with us what we can expect with the move from Gen AI into agentic AI. And now we're transitioning into coffee and conversation. So it's a quick 15-minute break just to the back of the room. And during that time, we encourage you to recharge and connect and also explore the booths that we have over to the side. We have CFA Society Barbados, CIBC Caribbean, and also the National Financial Literacy Program. We will reconvene at 10:15, so please be back in your seats on time. And the next session is one you will not want to miss. So enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your break. As we continue today's journey, we turn our focus to one of the most powerful drivers of modern business success: credibility. In a world where investors demand more than financial returns, sustainability reporting has become a critical bridge between transparency and access to capital. Our next speaker brings deep expertise at the intersection of sustainability, finance, and strategic transformation. With extensive experience guiding financial institutions and organizations across Latin America, he helps businesses align ESG priorities with investor expectations and long-term value creation. Please join me in welcoming Brian Ballard, Senior Manager in EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services, as he presents From Credibility to Capital: How Sustainability Reporting Unlocks Investor Confidence.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. First, I want to start, let me just get oriented here. Great. First, I want to start by contextualizing why we're talking about sustainability reporting today. Today, we are confronting a time of polycrisis. Climate change, water access, environmental degradation. We've already exceeded 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries that we exist within. This is no news for any of us. We've heard that for decades. Only today we are actually experiencing it and living through it more acutely. And I know we've already talked about sort of the alarming effects of AI, but now I want you to focus on some of the alarming and worrisome states of the environment and how it affects the way we live in this world. Within the past 10 to 15 years, these issues have become front and center to us. But not just as social impacts or impacts to human beings and how we live in this world, but also as business and economic ones, because they can be calculated, they can be measured, and there's material impacts on how we run our businesses, on the people that we employ in our economies, on the values that our countries generate. It seems like every company these days either reports on sustainability or it's evaluated on certain sustainability criteria. And today, stakeholders are making critical decisions, whether to buy products from a company, whether to invest in a company, whether to partner with a company, based upon what they're doing related to sustainability, and specifically around climate change. Climate change is more of the focus of my presentation today, just given the fact that we are mobilizing more than ever related to try to confront the climate change crisis, and yet we're still behind significantly in what we need to do to confront and to battle and to overcome this crisis. So arguably, the most important of these stakeholders is the investor. Companies cannot operate without capital. Companies need the investors that invest in these companies, that provide insight, that provide relationships, key relationships, and most importantly, provide capital. Over the past decade, sustainability data has evolved significantly from non-essential information to a standard variable of investor analysis. What used to be glossy page communication exercises has now become an expectation of capital markets. And today, investors are using sustainability information to better understand a company's exposure to risk, to resilience, to strategy, and to long-term value creation. In fact, according to the EY Institutional Investor Survey, which surveys around 350 investment decision makers around the globe, around 88% of investors say that their institutions have either somewhat or substantially increased its use of ESG information over the past year. So investors, when they're looking at the valuation of a company, when they're looking at key financial metrics, they're also looking at what a company is doing in terms of how it's confronting climate change, how it's integrating key sustainability factors in its decision-making, how it's actually communicating that information to its stakeholders in reports and data, etc. However, there is a gap, a pretty significant gap. Expectations of the quality of information have also shifted significantly over the past decade. For example, according to the same survey, sustainability issues like climate change are now a major driver for decision-making for investors. That is to say that when they look at a company, they want to know immediately, what are you doing to confront climate change? Not only how your company may impact the perpetuation of climate change, but also how are you thinking about how climate change is impacting your operations, your value chain, your stakeholders, your businesses, et cetera. Yet the majority of investors are still not convinced by the information that investee companies are putting out there. 80% of investors believe companies are not articulating well enough the rationale for why they're making investments in sustainability, or what sustainability initiatives they're focusing on, or what the return on investment is on those initiatives. 85% say that greenwashing is a greater issue now than more than 5 years ago. For those not familiar with greenwashing, that's making claims that you're doing something, or maybe you've measured something to show progress on certain sustainability-related indicators, and maybe that claim is overstated, or perhaps even understated in some cases, but mostly overstating is the concern, or misrepresenting information. And nearly 3/4 believe that third-party assurance would enhance the credibility of information reported. And that shows that confidence in the information being reported is weak amongst investors. If you're putting information out there that investors doubt, that they do not perceive as potentially true or misrepresented, and they believe that you should be accrediting that or assuring that with a third party, there's a huge accuracy issue there, and trust and confidence issue. On the other side, companies are also struggling. Typically, the sustainability reporting function sits within the finance function of a company. It takes a multi-team approach or a multi-effort amongst the finance teams, risk teams, legal teams, and also in some cases sustainability teams if the companies even have them. But this information is very complex. Most finance professionals don't understand the wide array of sustainability-related information. They are used to reporting information on specific financial metrics, things like their balance sheets, metrics related to their cash flows. But they don't know how to manage all this different data related to water, waste, emissions, or energy usage, for example, amongst many other things. Let's not forget that when you're talking about sustainability, or ESG, as it's also known as, there's also social and governance implications as well. So having to process all that information, not only collect it and process it and measure it and align on the methodologies that are going to be used, in addition to the functions that already exist for finance teams, is a lot of pressure. It's also significant to them that there's a lot of data challenges. There's data inconsistencies. Some data has varying different types of formats that are required to be put in place for the data to actually be measured. And there's also a significant amount of technology needs as well to process that information. These days, there are a lot of different technological applications to store the information, to process the information, to actually automate the reporting function in terms of processes and controls. And there's also applications that can allow you to measure and calculate the information if you feed in the data. Things like Watershed or some of the other major known ESG and sustainability vendors or digital applications. So not only do they not have access to them in a lot of cases, but they don't have any understanding of how to use these digital applications. There's also a significant fear of greenwashing, as I mentioned. Not only are investors concerned that companies are greenwashing, companies themselves are scared of putting out the right information or putting out any information related to sustainability because of potential litigation or potential reputational risk if they report on something that's erroneous or incorrect. This is a phenomenon of green hushing, where they put less information out there than they want to or that they actually have, just to manage risk effectively and try to minimize the potential litigation that could come forward. All of this creates a significant disclosure gap, where only 36% of entities are actually reporting on climate-related risks and opportunities these days. That's significantly low, given that in 2026, a majority of companies now, especially global companies, and especially companies that operate on regional levels, have some sort of sustainability report or some sort of sustainability disclosures. And yet, only 36% of them are reporting on this climate-related information. So this is all creating a major capital markets gap, where we have investors that understand the real impacts of climate change, that really understand the impacts of sustainability, and that truly want to read this information. They're examining it in their investor analysis, they're looking at it, and they want to use this information to make decisions related to capital allocation. And then you have companies that are gathering this information, that are actually trying to report on the information, but there's a huge gap in terms of the quality of information that investors want and the actual information that's being reported on by these companies. And all of this points to one thing. If you look at financial reporting over the past few decades, we've seen significant strides on standardization, a standardized common language for financial reporting. If you open financial reports in any country for most public companies, they all look the same. They all have the same information, they all include the same metrics, and they're all organized and presented in the same manner. Now, there are varying financial reporting frameworks, but overall, if you move from one country to the next, you can kind of compare them and you can kind of understand them. Investors today say that 80% of materiality and comparability is of a concern, is weak, basically. And that 62% of accuracy is pretty weak. And that's alarming when you're thinking about the kind of information we need to put in the market related to sustainability so that we can all organize ourselves and understand where we are as a world today in terms of confronting these challenges. But we don't have the right information and we're not aligned. And so the three main concepts that financial statements or financial reporting has that need to be brought into sustainability reporting are materiality, comparability, and accuracy. The first and most important, arguably, is materiality. And that's making sure that the information that you put in your sustainability report is actually financially relevant. A lot of companies think if I create a 90-page sustainability report, then I'm going to be given a golden star. I'm going to be rewarded in some way. But it is not the amount of information that you report on. It is what is financially material to your company. What a mining company is going to report on related to its activities and certain sustainability-related indicators is not the same as an energy company. It's not the same as a bank. It's not the same as a retail company. The value chains of all of those companies look significantly different. And for that reason, you need to report on what is most impactful for your financial statements, what impacts your cash flows, what impacts asset valuation, especially when you're thinking about climate change. Do you have assets in areas where they are more likely to be destroyed by climate-related catastrophes? Sitting here in the Caribbean today, we obviously know that the Caribbean is highly exposed to climate-related disasters like hurricanes, flooding, in some cases droughts. And so what are Caribbean companies reporting on today that is financially relevant for their sustainability reports? In terms of comparability, how can I open up one report from one company in one sector or in one industry and open up another report from one sector or a different industry, or maybe from one geography or another geography, and how can I compare them? How can I look at them and compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges, to make actual decisions around capital allocation? That's really difficult if there's no standardization, if there's no common framework. And how can the information be accurate? So when I think about accuracy, I really think about where did you get your data from and how are you measuring your data? How are you putting processes and controls in place to make sure that that data is completely accurate, that it's being collected in a proper manner? And who are the owners of that data? How can it be audited and traced? And thinking about specifically assurance. Is there a third party that's actually looked over this information that's not within your company, that has an unbiased approach? How can you assure that this information, and how can you explain that this information is actually credible and accurate? So what we need is a common framework, but it already exists. Today we have ISSB, and a lot of people talk about ISSB as if it's this new thing that's happening and it's going to happen in the future. And in some regions, like the Caribbean, it is something that's still very new because it's not fully adopted here. But ISSB is not new. It's actually already here. ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board that was developed by the International Financial Reporting Foundation, or IFRS. What ISSB does is it fulfills the same concept that the IASB does, the International Accounting Standards Board, but it does so for sustainability. The main objectives for ISSB is to create information that is investor-ready, meaning that it's information that investors actually want, and it's in a format, a reporting format that investors need. Something that is a baseline globally that we can use across all the world, across all jurisdictions, across all companies, and it creates a common framework, a common language. It also creates interoperability. So one jurisdiction can implement something that is aligned to ISSB, and it would be more or less similar to another jurisdiction with a very similar framework using the same baseline. Two other things that it does, which are very important, is it puts accountability on companies to publish the right information and to have information with integrity. The same accountability that companies have when they're doing financial reporting. And it also, famously, if you know anything about ESG or sustainability reporting, it reduces the alphabet soup of ESG reporting. ESG itself is an acronym, which is funny when you think about acronyms and in ESG reporting. But previously, we had GRI, TCFD, we have other reporting frameworks like CDP, SASB. Anyone who doesn't know anything about these, specifically the finance function of companies, would become completely nauseated with thinking about how do I remember all of these different acronyms? What do they do? What are the differences? What ISSB does is it creates a new acronym that basically is an umbrella one that consolidates all of these under one umbrella. Now, there are some nuances, of course, and I won't go fully into the detail today unless you want a crash course on ISSB reporting. I can do that later. But TCFD is a very important framework used for climate-related reporting, and TCFD is the foundation and the structure of ISSB. TCFD actually, ISSB is modeled after TCFD. So if you create an ISSB report, you have fulfilled all the recommendations and requirements for TCFD. It also involves significant materiality factors and sector-based information from SASB. So SASB is an important part of ISSB as well. And there's a really close relationship where ISSB does recommend the continued usage of SASB. CDP is a questionnaire for climate-related disclosures, and it's now integrated with ISSB as well. GRI still has its own separate reporting platform, and I'll talk about GRI more in a second. But this is complementary to ISSB. And so now we have a common framework, a common language that's positioned amongst all of these. And what this does is that it creates a global anchor. In June 2023, ISSB released its first sustainability standards of S1 and S2. And since then, they've already been adopted and used across a growing number of jurisdictions globally, and it's quickly becoming the global anchor for investor-focused sustainability-related financial disclosures. The IFRS Foundation reported that as of 2026, recently, in April, around 40 jurisdictions had adopted, used components of, or were finalizing steps to introduce ISSB standards into the regulatory frameworks. We now have a global language on sustainability reporting, and the direction of travel is from voluntary reporting to mandatory reporting, as you can see here from this map. So what are these standards, S1 and S2, and what do they entail? S1 essentially gives the overall architecture for sustainability-related disclosures. S2 applies that architecture specifically to climate. Starting off, ISSB is heavily focused on climate, given that climate is a common sustainability concern across all stakeholders and across all companies. All companies need to be reporting on climate, at least when it comes to sustainability. There are hopes and there are plans to expand the norms to other things, and S3 is expected to come out related to nature in coming years, and it's currently in development. But when thinking about what's available right now for S1 and S2, both are organized around the same four investor-relevant pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. You can see those little four yellow boxes there on the screen. This structure is no coincidence. It mirrors exactly how investors conduct due diligence. So it asks, who is accountable for climate-related or sustainability-related risks and opportunities? Who is managing these risks? Who is overseeing these risks? And that's where governance is critical. And then you have the business impact. How are the impacts of these sustainability risks and opportunities informing your strategy? Whether it's creating new products and services, or it's creating new plans for your operations, or it's actually rethinking about how you're measuring success in your company related to your financial statements or your financial metrics as well. Also, how are you thinking about managing these risks? How is it integrated in your enterprise risk management system? Who are the owners of certain information? Who's reporting on that information? Who's collecting that information? You need to show that in ISSB. And then if you think about progress, how is progress measured? How are the projections of progress planned? Do you have metrics and targets in place? How are you working on this to integrate it into your financial planning? Do you have greenhouse gas emissions goals or targets, for example? Do you have targets on water use reduction? Whatever your business model is, you would have appropriate metrics and targets to show the direction of travel for your company in relation to sustainability. The key difference here is that in the past, sustainability reporting was kind of treated as a checklist. I'm doing these things, check, check, check. I have this, and I have this. This is my beautiful report. ISSB is not a checklist. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you these are the indicators that you need to report on. It tells you instead, what it gives you instead is an investor and management dialogue framework that connects sustainability issues to performance, risk management, and risk pricing. And that's really a critical piece when you think about investors and how they're pricing your company or how they are pricing risk for your company as well. The main objective here is for sustainability-related financial information to be comparable, to be verifiable, and understandable, and easily understandable, I would add. ISSB adoption in Latin America is pretty impressive. Of the 40 jurisdictions in the world, 8 of them are in Latin America that have adopted or are currently adopting ISSB. ISSB adoption in Latin America is quite strategic, and it's more strategically important than ever for a few reasons. One is that companies in the region are seeking to align, especially regional companies who operate across multiple jurisdictions, are seeking to align with global capital market expectations. And so this matters because regional companies are increasingly competing for capital amongst international investors, especially institutional investors, banks, development finance institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank, and also bond markets that expect comparable sustainability-related financial information. And given the degree of exposure of climate-related risks in the region, Latin American countries cannot afford poor disclosure because investors need clarity in order to price risk. It's also notable that the 3 largest markets in Latin America have all progressed to adopt ISSB: Mexico, Chile, and Brazil. I work and live in Mexico at the moment, so I know the Mexican market quite well. In Mexico, we already have ISSB reports being produced as of April. They need to be, with the rule that's in place in Mexico, they need to be released, with your financial statements. And we're already working with dozens of clients on getting these reports out and ready ahead of the financial year deadline. There's an extension that's been made until July for most companies. In Brazil and in Chile, they're also racing to get this information ready because by next year they need to have reports ready for certain companies as well. In a climate-exposed region like the Caribbean, where we are today, investors already price in risk. If companies disclose nothing, investors may assume the worst and demand higher returns. So by disclosing climate risk, including how they're assessed, how they're managed, and the strategy around the mitigation of those risks, companies in the Caribbean can help investors better price that risk and see the opportunity here. Disclosure builds trust, it reduces uncertainty, and it positions a region like the Caribbean for better access to capital. Even if the Caribbean isn't there yet, and I know that there are conversations happening, whether it's in different accounting organizations or amongst other, maybe perhaps in the CFA Society as well, but even if the Caribbean isn't there yet on ISSB adoption, momentum is growing, and the influence from Latin America, its close by neighbor, is there. If business in wants to be better facilitated, especially with these Latin American partners. It's critical to have ISSB reports and to be preparing for these ISSB reports. In fact, right now, there is a relationship and there's an initiative with the Inter-American Development Bank with ISSB to try to promote adoption in the region and to prepare to align with ISSB, especially as more countries nearby in Latin America, like Costa Rica and Mexico, are already producing these reports for most of the financial institutions or for some other related companies as well. It's important to also note that there is a broader reporting environment. It's converging, but ISSB is not the only piece of the picture here or the piece of the puzzle. We are moving towards consolidation, and there's a lot of nuances and variations globally. The main message here is that ISSB is the investor-focused baseline. Other standards and frameworks still remain complementary for different purposes. I mentioned GRI earlier. So GRI is the oldest reporting framework out there. It's been around for decades, and companies are reporting on GRI consistently and continuously. GRI is not financially or financial materiality focused. It's focused on impact materiality. And so ISSB really hones in on financial materiality, meaning what are the sustainability related risks that really impact your financial statements, as I mentioned? What are impacting cash flows? What are impacting your asset valuation? Stranded risk is a huge concern. Stranded risk being the write-down of certain assets that might be exposed to climate-related risks, et cetera. Whereas GRI has a completely different approach. It's thinking, who are the stakeholders inside and outside of your company that you're impacting? What are the environmental considerations, the social considerations outside of your company that your company impacts? And so that impact reporting is critical for GRI and is going to continue to remain relevant, but it is not the focus of ISSB, which is purely investor-driven and financial materiality focused. You also still have TCFD and SASB. TCFD still has its recommendations that it outlines specifically for climate, and so it is key and helpful to really review and understand the recommendations of TCFD when preparing your ISSB reports, especially when you're trying to create that credibility and that confidence relationship for investors when they want to seek more climate-related information. And SASB is still a great source. They have what's one of my favorite features on their website actually is the materiality map. You can actually search on their website by your industry, very specifically what are the most material indicators that you should be reporting on and measuring against according to SASB. It also has country profiles, so you can look by country and see what are the most pressing materiality factors for your country when it comes to sustainability. SASB also is it's focused on financial materiality, which is the basis of ISSB, and that's why SASB was critical in developing ISSB as well. You also have other regional frameworks like ESRS or CSRD in the European Union. The European Union has taken significant strides and made significant efforts to develop one of the most ambitious and comprehensive sustainability reporting frameworks in the world. It is different to ISSB. ISSB is complementary and integrated into there's actually an interoperable framework that allows you to integrate ISSB information into ESRS, but it's much broader, ESRS. ESRS takes a double materiality approach. So it looks at materiality in two directions, not just the financial materiality, that is to say, what are the sustainability related impacts on your company or financial related impacts like, water stress or the effects of climate change, emissions, et cetera, how those things might affect your balance sheet or some of your other financial statements. But also, what is the other direction, which I've already mentioned with GRI? What is the impact that your company is making externally? And that's really the focus of the European regulations right now, is that double materiality exercise. It's still critical for companies to understand all of these frameworks and how they fit into this global reporting landscape. The landscape is not becoming more simple, but it is becoming more organized, and that's really the key message here. Fewer central frameworks, greater comparability, and more pressure from mandatory assurance-ready disclosures. It is really important when you're, especially a global company, or as I mentioned, if you're if you're operating across regions or across one region, to really have a robust reporting strategy in place, because every single framework has different nuances, and every single jurisdiction has different nuances. 40 jurisdictions reporting or requiring reporting on ISSB may sound simple, but each jurisdiction has their own phase-in times. They have their own transition reliefs. In Mexico, for example, they have a rule, it's a first-year transition relief, where you only have to focus on reporting on S2. If you can't get the information for S1, you can just get climate-related information ready and put a S2 report out there. There's also a lot of details or nuances related to assurance requirements. So some jurisdictions don't require assurance at all. Some require limited assurance, whereas others require full assurance. And so understanding the different nuances as well, just amongst ISSB regulations, is critical. But also really understanding the differences between all of these other emerging regulations across different markets as well. As I mentioned, ESRS is quite a beast. It's been recently revised and significantly reduced in terms of the number of requirements, around 60% of reduction in data points or required data points in its recent omnibus revision. And there's also, they've also gotten rid of mandatory sector standards, and they've established limited assurance. So some of those key changes are critical, and it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, so it is important to remain up to speed on what's changing regarding ESRS in Europe. There are also other movements in other markets as well. In California, in the United States, has been really a major trailblazer in trying to get regulations on the state level, given the lack of federal regulations in the United States at the moment. California is requiring companies to report on their emissions. There is a bill that is currently paused on climate risk as well. And they're both quite ambitious, and other states are following. There are similar laws in California, in New York State, in New Jersey, amongst a number of other ones that are modeled off of the California bills. And then you have the Canada rules as well in North America. So not just Mexico and not just some states in the United States, but also Canada is releasing its own ISSB-aligned regulations and rules with its own phase-in timelines and assurance expectations as well. For now, it's focused on voluntary adoption, but it is really pushing to have mandatory adoption over coming years. In Mexico specifically as well, there isn't just ISSB. Mexico has another reporting framework called the NIS, or Las Normas de Información de Sostenibilidad, or the Sustainability Information Norm. And what the NIS is 30 very specific indicators that companies are required to report on that range from energy use, emissions, water, etc. And this is in addition to potentially also having to report on ISSB if you fall into that scope for that other regulation. So all of these things require not just a singular approach to sustainability reporting if you're operating globally. It requires a pretty robust approach, and it requires a coordinated effort across different teams, especially involving legal to understand the different jurisdiction rules, and especially understanding what information needs to be prepared for each one. So what do you do now? If we're rooting back to kind of our conversation of the main thesis or the main topic here, which is from credibility to capital, how do you prepare for ISSB? How do you prepare for sustainability reporting if you haven't thought about it yet? There are a few broad steps that I've outlined on things to think about. One is understanding applicable reporting regulations and timelines, as I mentioned on the previous slides. So really assessing local sustainability disclosure rules and understanding what are the requirements is critical. And that includes phase-in dates, transition reliefs, assurance expectations, and how they may or may not align to S1 and S2. There are a lot of variations in terms of how jurisdictions align to ISSB. Number two, I would say, is defining your reporting approach. So reviewing IFRS S1 and S2 guidance in its full. They both have different documents with very specific guidelines. They're quite intensive in terms of the amount of details, so you can bring it to bed at night and read it before you sleep. You can also try to pinpoint illustrative examples and industry-based metrics that really make sense for your company. and start thinking about how this information should be structured, connected, and presented into an ISSB report. The most important thing is number 3. A key critical point or concept for ISSB is connectivity. Connectivity is connecting your sustainability-related information to your financial statements. So how can you ensure that these climate and sustainability risks are actually articulated in a way that are clearly connected to financial outcomes or clearly connected to financial impact? How do these things impact your strategy, your asset values, impairment indicators, financing, insurance, resilience, et cetera? If you think about things like your enterprise value, have you factored in the effects of climate change on your operations? If you are a global company with operations across the world, if your value chain expands multiple countries, multiple continents, even in some cases just multiple cities, have you actually done a proper climate risk analysis to understand what the potential impacts on storms or increased likelihood of hurricanes or increased likelihood of flooding or droughts, all of those things on your business operations? And have you actually discounted your enterprise value according to some of those metrics? Have you integrated those assumptions into your cash flow assumptions as well? Have you really thought about it in terms of some of the other key metrics that you're looking at in your financial statements and financial planning? And then from there, step 4 is really building reporting readiness. So now you have all of the information. You've laid out what you need to do. Where are your gaps as a company? Do you have a governance structure in place today? Do you have a sustainability function? Do you have a oversight team, whether it's a sustainability committee, an oversight committee, et cetera, that really helps you understand and mitigate and manage these risks or implement the collection, the processing, and the measurement of this data? Do you have a risk management plan or some sort of risk management framework that integrates sustainability into your enterprise risk management system? Are you thinking about who the owners are of certain data? Are you thinking about if you have enough evidence on the methodologies you're using on your greenhouse gas emissions inventory? Are you aligning your greenhouse gas emissions inventory to leading practices or leading frameworks like the GHG protocol? Are you actually measuring things in a way that makes sense? Are you presenting them accurately? Have you had it vetted and verified by third parties? Are you having it assured? So mapping out all of these gaps will help you plan step by step on how to get there so that you can create something that is credible and robust for investor expectations. And then using available resources. You can review the IFRS Foundation jurisdictional profiles on their websites that outline by country what the rule entails, what the requirements are, what the transition release may be, what the phase-in dates are, if there is an assurance requirement, et cetera. There's also several educational materials by ISSB as well, just to understand more and educate internally. One of the biggest challenges that we have as consultants when we work with our clients is just simple education and alignment internally. I've done so many presentations or workshops with multi-teams or people from across different functions inside of companies, and none of them know anything about sustainability. And you have a risk person on the call, you have a legal person on a call, you have an operations, a facilities person on a call, and none of them understand why they need to report this information, why it's important, what information they need, why do they have to do more work. So it's really important to understand how to educate people on why this matters, why it has an impact on your business, and also that it is business aligned. It is a part of your business, and it should be a part of your strategy. And then we also have illustrative examples on EY's website. We have one example specifically. We have a fictitious ISSB report for a fictitious company called Good Group, where you can actually see what an ISSB report would look like. And you can see the connectivity piece, which is really the most confusing part about developing an ISSB report for most companies, is how do you communicate it and connect it to your financial statements. This isn't just a standalone fancy sustainability report. This is an integrated part of your financial statements. Is in the back or in part of the report, you have this ISSB linked information for S1 and S2. And so we have a number of resources as well on the EY website around ISSB, IFRS, and it's important. So I encourage you to take a look, and please reach out to me if you have questions. I'm here to talk more about this today. For now, I just want to leave you with a closing note, though. So really understanding and thinking about how investors are looking at this information. And even if investors aren't looking at this information, we all know that climate change specifically and many other sustainability risks have key and real material impacts on our companies and on our lives as people working for these companies, as people living in environments where these companies operate. So really thinking about how these impacts matter and that investors are really looking for the right information. Understanding what credibility looks like is key. Sustainability reporting will not unlock capital simply because a company publishes more information or simply because it publishes a pretty report. It unlocks confidence when information is credible, comparable, financially relevant, and connected to its strategy. And in that sense, credibility really becomes a capital markets advantage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan, for giving us that peek behind the curtain when it comes to sustainability reporting. And as we continue, we now turn our attention to another vital frontier of economic transformation, one where culture, innovation, and enterprise converge. Across our region, the creative economy is emerging as a force for jobs and inclusive growth. But the question remains, how do we finance its full potential? To answer that, we have a speaker who has been at the forefront of designing and delivering solutions across Latin America and the Caribbean. But before we move ahead, I'd like to pause to thank our sponsors once more for powering today's conversations and connections. CIBC Caribbean, Sidel Bank and Trust, the National Financial Literacy Program, EY, and Courtesy Garage. Now please join me in welcoming Eliana Prada, Specialist in Creative Economy at the Inter-American Development Bank, as she presents Financing Models for the Creative Economy, Lessons from Latin America and the Caribbean.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Okay. So before I plunge into my presentation, does anybody know what the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, is? So only one person in the room? No one knows what the Inter-American Development Bank is? This is important because, when you are working in a field, you take it for granted that take it for granted people know what the IDB is, So let me begin by that maybe, and then I present myself and everything. So the Inter-American Development Bank, the short would be IDB, is the largest and longest standing source of financing and knowledge for Latin America and the Caribbean. We are at headquarters, where I work is in Washington, D.C., but we have representation offices in 26 member countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, one of them here in Barbados. And then we have an office in Asia, and we have an office in Europe, based in Madrid, to cover 4 continents. So that's what we do. We provide financing and knowledge. So you will hear me say IDB, standing for Inter-American Development Bank. And I lead the creative economy agenda at the IDB, and within the competitiveness, technology, and innovation division, okay? So with that, I would like to share with you why the IDB, a multilateral organization, is related or is interested in the creative economy. Also what the creative economy is, because maybe you don't know what the creative economy is, and where the intersection between financing and the creative economy, where it is, and where the opportunities are. So before giving you all that, I would like to start with a quote that I heard in a space like this, in a conference hosted by Deloitte in 2024 that really resonated with me. And the quote goes something within these lines. When bankers get together for dinner, they talk about art. And when artists get together for dinner, they talk about money. And it really, it made me laugh at that time, but it really resonated with me and all the philosophy that we push within the creative economy because it really exemplifies the importance of bringing together banking or financing and culture, arts, and the creative industries that I want to delve into right now. And the quote is by Oscar Wilde. So remember that quote, artists, and the banking of the financial system bringing together, sitting together at the same table. Okay, so what is the creative economy? What does the IDB have to do with the creative and cultural industries? And why does financing these creative sectors matter so much? So first, I will start by giving an IDB. You will have UNESCO, United Nations, and many others definition. But for us, our own definition of the creative economy is a group of activities where ideas are transformed into cultural and creative goods and services that are often protected by intellectual property rights. Sometimes they are not. Most, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a huge lack of IP protection, and also in the Caribbean. So that's what I said, they are often protected. They should be protected by IP, but not always the case. And the creative economy is huge. Can anyone think of sectors related to the creative economy? Any ideas? Yes? Tourism, excellent. Especially here in the Caribbean, that the economies thrive on tourism. Tourism is one of them. For instance, we can think of audiovisual, right? Cinema, TV. We can think of music, gastronomy. I mean, it's huge. So what you see in front of you is how we structure the analysis of those sectors. Because, for instance, for the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, it could be, 30 creative sectors, and some other organizations can focus on others. So we classify the traditional artistic activities where you will see visual arts, performing arts, right? Then we have the creative industry, and we have the creative support activities. So within the creative industry, we have cultural and functional areas, right? And so the functional creations, or I would say the most productive, intensive, if I could say that in English, or those activities that are most leading to productivity are music, video games, digital animation, and the audiovisual sector. And then we have the cultural industry per se, with arts and crafts, editorial, audiovisual, and music. Creative support activities are everything that support those, marketing, design, and packaging maybe as well, marketing, okay? So when we coined the term orange economy back in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, we were the leading organization speaking about the orange economy. And it's surprising, but at the same, it's glad when I come across countries that still talk about the orange economy instead of the creative economy. So we've transitioned from that term that originally was coined by us as orange economy, and we moved towards talking about the creative economy because we saw that the whole narrative in the internet sphere or in other organizations was about the creative economy. But if you hear orange economy, or as I say, I have it in Spanish, excuse the Spanish, but I will say it in English. We talk about the orange universe when we first analyzed and did a taxonomy about the 38 creative sectors. So that's what it stems from. It's because originally when we introduced the creative economy agenda into development, we were referring to it as orange economy and the orange universe of all these creative sectors that you see here. So we focus on 38, but the ones that have the strongest projection for growth until 2030 are, and I want you to remember this, the audiovisual sector, video games, music, and everything that has to do with ad tech. Of course, because of the platforms and everything is ads, as you can see, right? We Google one word, and then we have plenty of ads related to ad. So the ad tech sector within the creative economy is huge. And those four are the largest growing sectors within the creative economy. Okay, and these are figures. There's only one there's only one wrong figure that I tried to change it, but it was already submitted, so my apologies for that. There's only one wrong data there, and I will correct it now. So I want you to remember what I said at the beginning about the quote by Oscar Wilde. I want you to remember the sectors, if you can. Where are the most, the growest sectors of the creative economy, which have the greatest impact for opportunities for investment and growth in the countries, right? And then these figures, why the creative economy is a huge sector for investment for us. Well, we have stunning data, as you can see. The creative economy represents 3% of global GDP. It employs 30 million people globally, and that, when we analyze the data in our region, the figures are as stunning, right? The equivalent in GDP in Latin America and the Caribbean is 2%. The creative economy generates almost 2 billion, 1.9 million jobs. And this was in a study with EY from before the pandemic. That's the only thing. Before the pandemic, up to 2019, there were yearly revenues of $124 billion created by the creative and cultural industries. So we see that this sector has huge potential for development. That's why we try to educate governments so much about the importance of investing in the creative and cultural industries, because they are drivers of economy, they are drivers of employment, they are drivers of inclusion. Why do I say inclusion? Because we have studied that within the main employers of youth and women are from the creative and cultural industries. So we say that drive innovation, sustainability, inclusion, and exports of goods and services. Are we good here for now? Okay. So what is our vision for the creative and cultural industries? At the IDB group, and I forgot to say that when I presented what the IDB is, we are comprised of three, let's say, how would I say it? Siblings, three parts of the IDB. The IDB, which I represent, our interlocutor, our counterpart are governments, right? Then we have the IDB Invest, which speaks with or works with and develops projects with the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then we have the IDB Lab, which is the part of the IDB that spurs innovation through entrepreneurship. So that's it, the whole IDB group. So when I speak on behalf of the IDB, and usually my counterparts is the government, the public sector. So the whole IDB group, we understand the value of creativity and culture, and we place it as a key component of a development strategy. We know it drives productivity and economic diversification, it creates employment and digital innovation, and it gathers talent, technology, and sustainability. So the region, just general information, because the current situation of the Latin America and the Caribbean gives us grounds to leverage on the creative and cultural industries. The region right now faces low growth and stagnant productivity. So we see the challenge is to diversify towards higher value-added sectors. That means not the traditional sectors, not manufacturing, not extractive industries, but knowledge-based economy and creative and cultural industries. So to drive that transformation and to make that leap from this stagnant situation of productivity, we are based on the formula of talent, technology, and sustainability, where we believe that creativity is an engine of competitiveness in the countries, and we're focused on developing projects on digitalization and new skills for the creative sector. This slide, I want to mention an example on one sector that we're really working heavily on, which is the audiovisual sector. It was surprising to me when we did a study, a study in partnership with Netflix, that every dollar invested in the audiovisual sector had multiplying effects on tourism, on gastronomy, on hotels. wherever there was a film production, right? And so we talk a lot about how much investing in creativity, in the creative economy, generates multiplying or a spillover effect, right? And we saw that in the OECD countries, the creative and cultural industries grow way faster than the industrial average sectors, and that the creative services already represent almost 20% of global exports. So we see, because of the first slide on impact data, that the problem is not the lack of data about the sector, but rather the financial valuation of this impact. So whenever creatives want to further their projects, what do? They do not have a counterpart, let's say, with commercial banks, because they lack the collaterals. They have very how would I say it, very informal structures within their businesses, so they cannot resort to financial banks for funding. So we see there's a deficit of businesses and technological skills. We see the lack of adequate financial instrument. There's fragmented governance among the levels, within the levels of government, and the lack of metrics and sectoral information. So my presentation, the subject line was, how can we move towards subsidies to another form of financing for the creative and cultural industries? So before, we used to have all the creative and cultural industries financed by philanthropic grants or competitive funds. The proposal here is to try to move towards investment in sustainability and impact, seeing the creative economy as such. So, exactly. So the idea is to see culture and creativity not like a nice to have or culture per se, but a true social investment with economic impact, right? So these are some of the examples. I'm not going to elaborate on all of them, but these are some regional, and you will see here Caribbean examples of the work that we do. So for instance, I mentioned a collaboration that we had in 2021 and 2023 with Netflix. So that turned into a concrete project in Colombia, where in the study we saw that the skills were most needed in the, let's say, the below the line chain within the audiovisual industry. I'll put it in simpler words, would be whenever there's a shooting in a country, right? The professions that go are always script writers and directors. Those are the above the level, let's say, professions within the audiovisual industry. But when, let's say, Game of Thrones goes and shoots in Spain, what happens most of the times, especially in our region, is that we lack the talent. We lack the connectivity. We don't have the infrastructure so that the big production companies can come to our, for instance, to my home country, Argentina, and shoot, a full movie or a full series there. So what we did in partnership with Netflix was, okay, let's try to train and offer skills needed for the below the line, those jobs, those positions that are going to be in each of every country. So in Colombia, we trained with Sandbox Audiovisual, we trained 1,500 young people so that they would be able to live up to the standards of the future prospective employers within the creative sector. And in Chile, we are working together in a partnership with MIT for data and applied technologies into the creative and cultural ecosystems. For the Caribbean per se, I'm going to share with you examples that there's one in development right now in Barbados and has to do with rehabilitation of the Carnegie Library. And so it's a cultural heritage program, right? And that one is extremely interesting. It's still ongoing. We don't have the impact results yet, but that one is the one country that I'm involved in right now the Barbados. With Trinidad and Tobago, I'm working in a technical cooperation to measure the economic impact of carnivals and festivals in Trinidad and Tobago. And what we want to do is to develop a methodology that we can then replicate in other Caribbean countries that also thrive from festivals, just like Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, and so the idea for the ideal world for the financial development in the creative and cultural industries will be to work together, private sectors, governments, and develop blended finance for the creative and cultural industries so that we can really cater to their financial needs. One example of this is a fund, it's called Screen Capital in Chile, that unites private capital and public credit lines to invest in audiovisual, video games, and digital entertainment, right? So from our standpoint, the goal would be to create an ecosystem where creativity is an investable asset for the private sector. So we are working with specialized financial intermediaries. We're focusing on developing cultural impact assessment and measurement and adapted regulatory and fiscal frameworks, as well as public policies aligned with current SDGs. So in my closing remarks to you would be, our goal is to, for instance, I have a 9-year-old daughter, and all she can think of was K-pop Demon Hunters, and what was the other one she was so enthusiastic about? But K-pop Demon Hunter is just impossible. Oh, and the other ones are the Labubus. Have you heard if you have kids at home? So I always wonder, Korea, Asia, and my daughter is consuming this information and knows all of the singers and, So what is it? How did they do it so that here in Latin America, we are consuming their creative products? So what would it take for us, Latin American and Caribbeans, to position our culture and creativity into the world, right? So the long-term vision would be us as a region where creativity is recognized not only as our identity, but as a powerful engine of development, inclusion, and trade of exports and goods and services. Thank you so much, and I will be happy to speak with you separately on any questions related to this topic. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. This is really important. If you have your phone, here in this QR code, I've included all of our data, all of our studies. We've been exploring the creative and cultural industries since 2010, but the IDB, funded in 1959, has invested in culture since its inception. So there you have all the information reports, everything related to the creative and cultural industries. And as you were saying, Anderson, and you too at the beginning, networking is the most important thing. So here's my QR for the LinkedIn. I'm open to conversing, introducing you to IDB Invest if you are in the private sector, showing you examples of the work that we do, how we work with the private sector, how we work with governments. So those will be the two most important QR codes for me: knowledge, what we do, what we've researched, and networking. Thank you.
Thanks, Eliana, for really prompting us to think about how we can develop the creative economy here in the Caribbean. And now it's time to connect the dots. We're bringing this morning's ideas together in our fireside chat, an honest, unscripted conversation tackling the forces shaping today's investment landscape. Joining us are our three speakers for today: Eliana, Ryan Ballard, and Amy Fletcher. If you can join us on stage. So we have a panel here rich in insight and real-world perspective. And we encourage you to join in. You can scan the QR code on your desk and send us your questions, or we do have 2 microphones that you're able to use as well. So we're going to start off with Ryan. In terms of climate change, how do you see that impacting Caribbean capital markets today? And how do you think we build more climate-resistant economies and capital markets?
Yeah, well, I'm no expert on the Caribbean, but I'll do the best I can. From what I've read, if we think about Hurricane Beryl that came through Barbados, in recent years, that really had an impact on specific industries, especially the fishery industry, which is a very important sector here in Barbados. It also had significant impact on assets related to the tourism sector, to infrastructure. All of those things can really be valued, as I was discussing in my presentation. And I think that when we think about climate change, the most vulnerable countries in the world that will be most impacted by climate change are going to be small island nations like Barbados and some of the other Caribbean islands around the area. And so I think, if we keep thinking about hurricanes as these isolated events, as like Hurricane Beryl, for example, if we don't think about, obviously we can't predict them, but there is a lot of data there and that exists that really show that the frequency is going to increase, and that you can even project how frequently they may happen in coming years. I think when you look at all of that data, especially like the central bank, I think major government agencies that are planning resilience, agencies for tourism, that agencies that might actually promote infrastructure, all of these major sectors and different government departments that might support these sectors need to be including climate change if they're not already. And forgive me if there's someone in the room that says that they actually are doing it really wonderfully. But theoretically, they need to be including these things into the valuation, of their own companies. And they also need to be building resiliency plans. I think thinking about, well, what is your plan A, B, and C when it comes to your company and regarding climate change? How can you create initiatives or create some sort of support for your company, if you're in the fisheries sector, for example, to ensure resiliency in a long-term way, to ensure that investors are comfortable, that you've really thought about how these risks are going to happen, how they could potentially impact your business, how you plan to deal with and confront these risks, and how do you have a plan to ensure that the risks are minimal. And I think that that's really key. Climate change is inevitable at this point. We're already living through it. And so I think just thinking in a forward-looking manner and really trying to consider these things when you're trying to build your business plan, when you're trying to think about long-term value of your company rather than just short-term returns for investors. I think thinking about all of those things would really help, I think especially a country like Barbados in planning its future and really thinking about financial projections.
Thank you for that. And I know you said you weren't too familiar with Barbados and the Caribbean, but just to bring it to Mexico, where you're based now, sure. How have you seen the capital markets there responding to the adoption of ISSB?
So the ISSB adoption in Mexico is still very early. We're in the first year of adoption. You can already see, number one, I think we're in the education phase. I think a lot of companies are trying to educate themselves on sustainability reporting. A lot of my clients that are Mexican companies, not necessarily global companies with operations in Mexico, but really Mexican companies, they might not have a CSO, a Chief Sustainability Officer, or like a sustainability team. So they're trying to organize how to structure the governance around this process. Who's going to oversee it? Who needs to be involved? Who are going to be the owners of data, et cetera? I think from there, they're also trying to figure out how to get this information collected and organized. I think because of the expectation for ISSB and the growing expectation, capital markets are already looking at this information and trying to understand and read it. I think if you think about major banks in Mexico, like BBVA or BBVA, which is one of the largest banks, or Banamex, Scotiabank, Santander, which are international banks themselves, they have pretty robust climate portfolios. They have pretty robust climate change and sustainability functions. So they are already analyzing the data. They're already looking at this information. But the next step is really transition. Some of these banks, like Santander, for example, they have their own metrics and targets, but how well are their investees aligned to their metrics and targets? So if they have this credit portfolio and they're giving out loans or giving out, credit to certain companies, do those companies have metrics and targets? Do their metrics and targets align to Santander's metrics and targets? I think that that's the phase that banks are in right now in Mexico, especially capital providers, because they're trying to understand, okay, now more companies are going to be releasing this information. More companies are going to be putting out details and data that we need to be examining. So they're doing the work for us. We don't have to necessarily collect the data manually from them. But how well is this information actually aligned now to our own sustainability strategy? And when do we start moving into that transition phase? 2030 is around the corner. A lot of major financial institutions around the world, and some in Mexico, have put targets, especially midway targets from 2030, between 2030 and 2040, and a net zero target perhaps in some cases for 2050. We are now rapidly moving through 2020. I feel like 2020 was 5 minutes ago sometimes, but we're already in 2026. We're rapidly moving closer to 2030, so now we have to show results. We have to show, are we getting close to targets? So I think that that's what ISSB is going to do. I think it's going to also really push capital allocation decisions. But I think first, the market needs to be educated on what is ISSB, what information is going to be reported. There needs to be more standardized approaches to releasing ISSB reports and how they look. And I think for right now, we're in the first year of reporting, so companies are still adjusting to that.
Thank you for that, Ryan. And just to switch gears a bit to Amy, I know you mentioned that individuals really now have to take more initiative in terms of their financial literacy and financial readiness. Do you think that the financial literacy initiatives going forward should include education on AI in financial decision making?
So do I think that financial digital literacy should include AI? Is that?
Yes. I mean, should be educating
excellent
persons on
question. Yes, I just wanted to make sure that I understood. Definitely. In fact, I kept using the phrase digital fintech literacy, which is something that's increasingly coming out of the literature and the studies on these issues. It does combine the two. And again, not everyone either wants to be or will be a computer scientist, but these algorithms now have such an effect on our lives. And I think appropriate for each grade level that, yes, I think that AI literacy is crucial on its own merits, but I think that that then dovetails well with a basic financial literacy. There are even a few cases I know of in the United States where they're beginning financial literacy at least by middle school. Now, again, that's going to vary depending on the sophistication of the information, but we're being asked to, if you think about, say, my grandparents, well, they got Social Security when they retired. They had a pension. They didn't consider themselves people that themselves played the stock market. And that in some ways was quite paternalistic, but in other ways it was very stable. And it was predictable, and the relationship between the state and the citizen was very strong. I think now that relationship is weakening, and I think that, again, is where legislation and the education system, yes, I think AI literacy on its own merits, but I also think that can then be wedded to a financial literacy, since we are being asked as citizens to take so much more responsibility for issues that in many ways can seem quite out of our control financially. So yes, I do think the two can be combined. Thank you.
Yes, and we have seen a lag between the job requirements and then the educational, the education that persons are receiving right now in schools. So how do you think with that lag that we in the Caribbean can upskill our workers, upskill our students to leverage the AI technology for career advancement and improve productivity?
I think one of the most important answers to that is to recognize that most institutions' ability to predict the job market it's just decreased rapidly. As I think I mentioned in my presentation, I've sat in those academic discussions around a big table where we talk about, what do we need to prepare our students for, and do we need new degrees, and do we need this, that, and the other. But the pace of technological disruption is speeding up to the point that I think the ability to make any long-term predictions is quite low, even for the most prepared, or no matter how much data you have. And you can have some fun conversations about what kind of new jobs might agentic AI create. But I think the fundamental key, if we step back from that brings us back to legislation and education. And it relates to, I think, this discussion of the creative economy, is resilience. Resilience and adaptability. And again, to use my grandparents, they trained for one thing, and that one thing tracked across a 40, 50-year career. They were good at what they did. They enjoyed it, but it started in their 20s and it went through 65, where you got the watch when you retired. I think the likelihood of that happening for most people in their teens and 20s today is almost non-existent. I mean, I think it just doesn't exist. So to me, where you start, again, is the education system. Elementary, middle school, secondary, college. It's got to become a fundamental part of the curriculum. And some of that is the foresight mentality. Whatever changes are coming, I'm adaptable. I've been through this before. I'm a problem solver. I can draw on my creative capacity. I can leverage my skills, think about something I trained for. Well, how can I now use that for something different? And I think that's something that we have to cultivate in young people. Because if I feel a bit overwhelmed by all the change in the world, I know they're digital natives. You couldn't pay me to be 18 right now. I mean, you just couldn't, because there's so much uncertainty. There's so much promise, but there's so much uncertainty. What do I choose? What do I major in? Where do I go? What kind of career am I going to have? How much debt should I take on to go to school if you have to borrow to do that? And then we're throwing them out into this world that is so disrupted and unstable. So bottom line, yes, I think that adaptability, foresight, and resilience is something we need to cultivate from the very youngest school levels, and then track it all the way through to uni.
Thank you very much. And just to switch over to Eliana for the creative economy, you have a very unique position where you see both the banking sector and then on the creative side as well. Why do you think the traditional lenders, for example, IDB, commercial banks, maybe not IDB, but why do you think they still struggle to view the creative economy as an investable asset class rather than more speculative?
Can you repeat the question? Where do I see the difficulty, let's say, in banks into seeing the opportunity?
Yes.
Is that the question? So I believe the real challenge is to, for instance, let's go back. Final goal would be, how do we get banks to see the opportunity investing in the creative economy? I see it in my day-to-day trying to educate my peer colleagues, economists, specialists in development, about, as well as you invest in, I don't know, an infrastructure project, well, you should invest in music, or, instead of investing in, I don't want to say health or education because then there will be a whole different conversation. But the idea is we need to gather more data about impact, updated information. The information I shared with you today is the most solid that we have, but it's from 2019, prior to the pandemic. And it's a challenge to get tangible, data about impact of employment for the whole region. We have data for countries, whenever they want to invest in them, in finding about the data and crunching the data for the creative sectors. So I believe the real obstacle is the lack of data and impact on the creative sectors. And then the informality of the sector is also an obstacle for banks or financial institutions to invest because, again, there are no collaterals, So I think moving towards generating data and then finding these instruments, blended finance, some sort of middle ground between understanding the reality and the fragility of these sectors, and that would be, yeah.
And we do see that there's some difficulties with persons being able to access finance in the creative space. How would you see that being a challenge versus the creatives themselves being able to translate that creativity into something that's investable for a bank?
Okay, you said, repeat the question, please.
All right. So how do you think the challenges compare versus, so on one hand, there's the access to the capital versus the creative individual being able to translate their creativity into something that's investable for the bank?
It's a tough question. I honestly don't know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, creatives face lots of obstacles into materializing their projects. So I really don't know the answer, Michaela, to be honest with you.
Do you think that is something there are maybe insights, or what are some first steps, for example, a creative in this room would need to be able to take to approach the bank and say, hey, I'm looking for some investment in this opportunity that I have?
So whenever we've studied the profiles of creative entrepreneurs prior to the pandemic and also afterwards, and what we see that they lack is investment skills, of course, and also business skills. So we usually train them in this capacity training, offers that we do at the bank. We usually help them understand that it doesn't matter if they're artists, they are equally businesses, and we help them pitch, let's say, their own businesses and help them develop a business plan. So something as basic as developing your business plan and then coming up to a formal bank or loaning institution, financial institution, to be able to show data, and that is a skill they lack today, creative entrepreneurs. So I think they need a change in mindset as to perceiving themselves as real entrepreneurs. There's usually a dialogue between, but if I work in culture or I'm a real artist, I cannot, charge for what I do, and that's why they are always in this informality. So I believe, before speaking with, a financial institution or a commercial bank, they really need to understand what their business is, the impact, have metrics, and then be able to establish a more sound dialogue.
Well, thank you very much, Ariana. We'll go back to Ryan. What is your opinion on there being a trade-off between return on investment versus the implementation of sustainability initiatives?
It's a good question. It's a common question. I don't know. So I think there's a lot of conversations, and obviously it depends on many factors and what your strategy is and what we're talking about specifically. But there is this kind of notion that you have to trade off returns for investing in sustainability. For example, if I'm an oil and gas company, if I switch to electric or renewable energy, it's not going to be as profitable. We've seen that that's not true anymore, right? I mean, you can see that industries like EVs, for example, over the past 20, 30 years. I mean, imagine where we were in the 90s talking about EVs, and it's just not going to happen. In fact, there's a very famous documentary about it, about how we killed the electric vehicle. Well, now it's back, right? I mean, now companies have seen how to make it a viable business model. You see the Teslas of the world, but you also see all companies now, all car companies actually having their own fleets of electric vehicles. They've made it into a business opportunity that's aligned to the energy transition, that's aligned to sustainability, global sustainability goals. If you look at certain products and services, circular economy is a really important component of, not necessarily climate related, but just a really important component about how to transition your business model in a way where you're using the outputs that you create, or some of the waste you create, back as inputs into the companies themselves to create the same products or to run certain operations, et cetera. And so that circular economy component has a tremendous value. It saves costs. It can actually boost profits over time. I mean, promoting the fact that you use circular economy in your own products and services is a differentiator in the market as well. So there are a lot of ways that sustainability actually creates value, and that's really where we're moving towards when we talk about sustainability. We're not talking about sustainability anymore as this compliance exercise, this boring, oh, here's a report, check the box. In some places, and in some cases, that still is important because companies need to do the minimum, right, to really show that they are doing things in line with our planetary boundaries now, or they're doing things that are in line with local regulations, or they're doing things that are not damaging external communities or damaging the external environment. But in other cases, we really are moving towards sustainability as a value driver. You don't have to, and that's really the whole argument around, and the whole basis of ISSB as well, is the whole financial materiality. In the 90s and the 80s, 90s, maybe even 70s, we had CSR, corporate social responsibility, where companies were developing these CSR reports, maybe opening a foundation. They had nothing to do with their actual operations. You look at a lot of major mining companies, they would open up, these separate foundations, and they might have these really nice NGOs that might, teach local women in a community around their operations about gender empowerment, financial literacy, et cetera. Wonderful programs, like nonprofits they definitely have a place in this world, but it has nothing to do with the actual business model of a mining company. The mining company is polluting. I'm sorry, I don't want to attack the mining sector. Most of them are my clients, actually. But no, I mean, there are concerns around the emissions related to mining companies. There are concerns around labor rights, in terms of what laborers, the extreme circumstances that laborers are exposed to in their working conditions. Those are material issues that you need to be focusing on. How do you improve those things for your company model? Not only to look good on a magazine or in your paper, but also so that you really mitigate risks and you really drive value for your company. You reduce litigation risks, you reduce reputational risks, you're driving value from a perspective of making sure that accidents and injuries are down in your company. That's less cost for you. Or if you're driving down emissions and you're using energy more efficiently, that means you're spending less on emissions. Or if you're in a place or an economy or a jurisdiction that might be implementing a carbon tax, those are also taxes that you'll be avoiding. You'll be paying less. And then there's also the examples that I mentioned earlier about product differentiation, et cetera. So there's a lot of ways where sustainability can be a driver. And if you're thinking about it in a way that's integrated with your business model, that is financially relevant to you, financially material for you, then it won't be a cost. Then it won't be, you won't be sacrificing returns. I do think that we live in a world, in a system, where inevitable or uncontrolled growth is sort of the way that companies need to be operating. We have quarterly expectations, annual returns to investors, et cetera. So there are also expectations that maybe we need to shift from in our systems around growth. How much are we continue to expect companies and economies to grow? And with growth comes things like higher emissions, or other risks to the planetary boundaries within which we exist. So I think thinking about those things on a systemic level is maybe for governments to think about and business leaders. But for now, investing in solutions that are really aligned to your business will bring value to your business model if thought about in the right way.
As you speak about value creation, say we hire EY, we have this great sustainability reporting included. Are you seeing investors really using that to inform their choices?
Investors to inform their choices on capital allocation specifically? I think there are a lot of cases. I think some of the biggest investors in the world, like BlackRock, some of the big banks as well, they do show that they integrate these factors in their investment processes. There are first movers on, Tesla is probably the best example. It did have pretty significant investments in the beginning from investors that really believed in whatever the CEO was looking and the executive team was looking to promote. And that was at a time when still EVs there was a little confidence that they would really take off. I think that there's plenty of examples out there. If you look at different banks, they have green portfolios now. They have specific products for investors to invest in related to ESG portfolios, related to how they can gather companies that are aligned to certain the energy transition or maybe to sustainability goals and put them in a portfolio for investors to invest in. I know a few years ago I was looking at a pretty major investor and they developed an ocean portfolio. So it was like all of these companies that sort of promoted caring for the ocean in different ways, whether it was reducing plastic consumption or technologies that actually promoted taking care of the ocean as well. So I think that there are a lot of investors that are showing, that they're making certain decisions in capital allocation, but they tend to be siloed still. They tend to be really focused on, okay, we have this portfolio over here that's ESG focused. We have these things that you can invest in that are, sustainability friendly. I think that the biggest challenge, as I mentioned in my presentation, is that investors don't have the right information. That when they're doing a top-down or bottom-up analysis, when they're doing fundamental investor analysis, it can be a very quantitative process with some qualitative components. And it's really hard to fit the sustainability information in there if it's not packaged correctly, if there's no real financial materiality considered. And so I think if we streamline reporting in a stronger way, if companies can strengthen how they actually communicate their performance, especially with key metrics in a quantifiable way, I think that's when we'll see investors actually integrating it in a more holistic way.
Thank you, Ryan. And just to go back to Amy, do you think governments will play a significant interventionist role when it comes to AI expansion? And do you see that role being more in advance or more reactionary?
Wow. That's a really fundamental question, isn't it? I think, in the United States right now, a term that we're hearing a lot that we haven't heard in a long time is oligarchy. That there is a consolidation of power among the very biggest companies and the most powerful political interests, and it's become quite impenetrable to democracy. But we also know that we are having what many have called a populist revolution in a way that we've not really seen before in the United States, except perhaps in the 1930s, around the time of the Great Depression. So I think so much of the answer to that question depends upon, and this gets us back to our person from 1914, the poet W.B. Yeats famously said World War I had just ended and he was writing a poem, and oddly, it almost predicts World War II, because he talks about the gyre is unwinding, the center cannot hold, and we're moving to some sort of confrontation. So those of us in foresight tend to be optimistic that things can always be made better, that we can have consultation and we can have smart strategic thinking and workshops like this, and I still cling to that. But I think a lot of it comes down to how fast this pace of change is and if the financial and social support mechanisms that we developed in the 20th century hold. Because I do think if you get your worst case of mass unemployment, throwing people out of work just in the name of profit, not cultivating the skills of your workforce, I think certainly, speaking of the United States, which I know best, I think it could end up being very reactive, very unable to affect the change. And in my worst case scenarios, I do sometimes fear that we are moving towards some sort of collision between the people, if you will, and the system and the technology, and it might not, if I may be dramatic, but I do sometimes fear it can't resolve itself without violence. So we either rebuild these democratic institutions and we rebuild public trust and we try to come up, because America is so divided right now. I'm a political scientist. I used to teach 20 years ago, and the room would be bubbling with disagreement. The last time I taught, about 4 years ago, in an American classroom, we had people on this side of the room, literally, and people on this side of the room, and the concept of discussion it was bizarre to me. And I actually had a student, I know this is an anecdote, but it speaks to the point. I had a student come up to me and say, "Ma'am, we understand what you're trying to do, and I wish that we could, but if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to be canceled. People aren't going to sit with me at lunch, and in the worst case scenario, I'm not going to get a job because I've expressed an opinion here or here, whatever side it's on." And I've never seen that before in the United States. There's always been a lot of churn in the US and a lot of yelling and a lot of talking and a lot of drama. But the center does not seem to be holding. So certainly my reference here has been to the United States. I think it is imperative that smart governments step forward, they rebuild trust, they cut down on the drama, they bring people back into the fold, and they realize that yes, we all like to make money, we all like successful companies, but if the companies completely cannibalize the social sphere, and we're all just thrown back into this winner-take-all competition, I think both in the United States and globally, it could be very reactive and might be too little too late, if that's not too depressing. So.
Thank you, Amy. I think we had someone on the floor that was looking to ask a question.
Actually, a couple questions, if I may. First, for Amy, what do you think? And maybe you kind of answered this already indirectly, but what do you think is kind of the biggest ethical risk that's misunderstood or underappreciated right now? And then, as a small kind of follow on our side, recently, Professor Richard Dawkins, after interacting with a Claude model, declared that it was conscious. Do you have any thoughts on that? And does the answer for either of those questions change when we think about the next evolution, which might be artificial general intelligence?
Okay, I'm sorry. I heard the first part, and then the second part, the second question?
Around AI being conscious, Professor Richard Dawkins.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yes. I don't know if you saw that, but he interacted with a Claude model, and he declared that it was conscious. So that stirred up a lot of debate around consciousness for AI and what that means.
The first question, the biggest risk, I think, if I may, there's two, but they're related. So I'm going to collapse them. I think, first of all, again, is the algorithmic literacy. And I struggle with this because it's an incredibly specialized field that requires an extraordinary amount of training and smarts to do. But the degree to which algorithms are penetrating our lives now, when we have no idea how, or why, I think is a huge ethical risk. They kind of operate in the background, and I have a suspicion that might be where certain powerful interests would prefer they operate. But just as a quick example, and again, this comes back to the creative economy, I have a friend who did very well with a Substack newsletter. She's been doing that for years, and it became a third of her freelancer's income. Well, for better or worse, the company decided to make changes, and her whole monetization logic is out the window. She either moves to another platform, she adapts, she doesn't. Who's listening? Why is some content being elevated and other content isn't? How is what I think is autonomous decision-making being driven by what the algorithm is putting in front of me? Have there been decisions made about me, say for a job, that no human ever saw? That resume. I mean, this is a big thing on LinkedIn right now, a lot of churn around that discussion. There was a woman who, she got roasted for it, but there was a woman on LinkedIn who said, I am so tired of everybody using generative AI for their resumes. They all look the same and they sound the same. And several of us said, so do you use AI to weed out that first group of people? Well, yes. Well, we do. And do you use AI to write the job description? And plug it with keywords that if you don't strategically use the keywords, you're not ever going to get a look in, no matter how talented you are? So again, this anecdotal, but it speaks to your point. I think the biggest ethical risk is that we are handing more and more control, governments, businesses, and individuals, to algorithms. And we're not going to roll them back. Progress will happen. But we've got to make that a fundamental part of our literacy. The second quick thing I would say to that I think is related is let's all be very careful at looking how words are used. Because I was in grad school when the internet really took off, and I loved, looking back now, remember all that talk about it's going to democratize? It's going to democratize content, and it's going to democratize creativity, and you can throw your book on Kindle and become a millionaire. Well, you can, but the people who seem to be doing the best on any of these social media platforms had a platform to begin with, and they just brought it over. If you are trying to build from scratch, wow, that's going to be hard to do. So yes, it democratized creativity, but it didn't necessarily democratize earning capacity. And I think that relates again to the algorithm. And one other anecdote, and then I'll quickly answer the next question. I won't say which one, but I recently decided to stop being on a particular social media platform because I realized that I was getting followers because I was becoming more obnoxious, right? Thoughtful posts that engage. I'm going to take your point seriously and respond to it seriously and respectfully. They go nowhere. What goes somewhere, gets me followers and goes viral is me saying, well, that's just the dumbest thing I ever heard, right? Or something like that, and being really obnoxious. And that's just how the algorithm's geared. If you want to play that game online, that's fine. But I was realizing, okay, insofar, and I'm going to take a risk that I'm not going to be on that platform, but it's a risk I'm willing to take because it's turning me into a person that I don't quite recognize, and I don't quite like how this person is engaging with other people. And then finally to Richard Dawkins. Don't you think it's interesting that Richard Dawkins has been an atheist for all these years and spent one evening with generative AI and suddenly decided it was conscious because they complimented his book? Right. I mean, I know, let me say, since we're on camera, I know Richard Dawkins is a very intelligent man. I have read his books. I have great respect. But it did cause quite a lot of discourse when Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, skeptic, likes to cut through the hype, so easily came around to the view that there's something going on here and I can't quite figure it out, and I think it might be consciousness. All I can say to that, being on the legislative and ethical side as opposed to the scientific side, is there is still such a debate going on in specialist circles. Some computer scientists are telling us, Elon Musk is telling us, you give it another 5 to 10 years, and we are in a completely new space. I think Ray Kurzweil referred to it as the singularity. And the singularity for philosopher Ray Kurzweil is that in 2040, we're going to cross a line, give or take. We'll live in this world. The computers will become smarter than we are. We walk across that threshold and nobody knows what happens then, because that is a completely new world for us. So very serious people think that fully conscious AI is on the way, but I do know that some very serious people as well say that we may be getting in front of ourselves on that. So I think we just have to leave that open, because specialists with far more specialist knowledge than me are debating this at length. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you. And do we have any more questions from the floor? Yeah.
Hi. Two questions. One for Mr. Ballard first. Honda recently reported its first annual loss in 70 years, citing losses in EV investments. Could you speak to the ISSB framework or other frameworks that allows for a transition from the oil and gas to the new renewable energy?
Which framework?
Well, any framework that you know, or if the ISSB framework allows transition from the old world to the new world.
Okay, got it. So generally what I think, like how companies can transition, or specifically the oil and gas, or, sorry, maybe just repeat your question. Maybe if you could speak a little closer to the microphone.
Sorry.
There you go.
Oh, my apologies.
No,
if
it's okay.
there's any framework that allows for transition from the old world to the new world.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, so when we think about sustainability, there's no, even though I just tried to preach that there's one, global framework. So the framework that I mentioned today, ISSB, is really a reporting framework. And it's not prescriptive in the sense that it doesn't have like a roadmap on exactly the information you're supposed to report on. It's a framework that's standardizing the reporting, and then the information is going to be different based upon each company, based upon the sector, their operations, their global footprint, et cetera. And it's really an information framework. When it comes to some sort of like solution framework on how we can transition as a world, I don't know if there's like a one size fits all. I think the thing about the energy transition is that, or the green transition, you can call it many things, is that there's so many moving parts. There's so many things that have to happen. It is a coordinated effort globally, across countries, across companies, across sectors. So it's really hard to say, like, do we have like one thing? I mean, if we had a roadmap, I mean, maybe some world leaders would just throw it out because they don't like sustainability, but I think we would probably be there by now. I think that when you look at, depending on the sector, EV, yes, I did hear your point about the losses. I'm not an expert exactly on why that's happening. I don't have that information. I think it could be for a variety of reasons, though. And there are, it's an uneven market. There are some countries in some markets where it's growing more than others, and where maybe, its market share is shrinking, et cetera, for different reasons. But it still is, if you look at kind of the growth over the past few decades, it still is a solid example that it is possible for other industries to follow suit. I think that there are also several examples of energy companies specifically trying to carve out renewable energy portfolios and grow that more. I think that the frustrating thing, though, is that with sustainability, you really do need some level of government intervention. We see in the United States that the United States is a massive economy, and it's a good example of how you need many different sectors and many different things to happen at the same time for us to achieve our own targets. And as soon as we have a change in, government, priorities can shift and things can quickly be undone. That maybe we had like pretty consistent progress for a while, and now we're going backwards. I think as soon as we saw some changes, like the U.S. sort of removes itself from the Paris Agreement, unfortunately that has consequences where some major oil and gas companies then deprioritize their investments in renewable energy. So there is some level of government coordination and effort that does need to exist. I think that's the first step, is what ISSB is hoping to do, and what these jurisdictions are hoping to do is getting companies to start reporting information and collecting information, and then they start thinking about how to put metrics and targets, and then they're forced to kind of think about, how do we achieve these metrics and targets? If I'm not reducing my emissions, I'm not going to achieve my greenhouse gas emissions target in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years. And I can't do that unless I change my operations, unless I examine my product portfolio and think about, where are the carbon hotspots and how can we reduce this, or what can we create that not only will help reduce our carbon footprint, but also we have to consider, changing consumer preferences. These days, a lot of consumers want to see greener products. They want to see things that are good for the world and good for the environment. I'm a millennial, and I think that was a huge part of being a millennial, is that we wanted the world to change. I don't know, Gen Z is kind of a wild card these days, but I do think that the overall goal of most consumers now is to buy something from a company that doesn't have a lot of negative impact on the world. So yeah, I don't think we have one model. I think that there is a transition plan framework. It's called the Transition Plan Initiative, I think, TPI. And it does lay out a framework for how companies, countries, different entities can think about transition and transitioning. And once again, it's not prescriptive. It's not like this is how you do it, but it's more of, how do you organize the information in your organization to move towards action and not just reporting. And that's really key in transition as well. Sorry, I'm sure that was extremely vague, but I hope it answered your question.
Thank you. Also, does the ISSB framework highlights, for example, if I'm polluting, but let's say buy 50 acres in Kenya as a carbon offset, does the reporting framework account for that?
Does it accompany offset specifically?
Yeah.
So it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you that you should use offsets, whether or not, or that. But if you're doing that, you need to be transparent that you're using it. So I'm working with a client right now, and we had to. It's a global, financial sector client, and they have operations in Mexico, and not really for ISSB reporting. They're actually reporting on the NIS, which is the other framework that I showed. But globally, they do report on ISSB, so this kind of wraps up into their ISSB report. But one of the indicators is their energy consumption. And very clearly, they disclose, because if you don't disclose it, it really breaks trust in investors if you just disclose certain numbers for your scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions or your energy consumption. If they very clearly outlined on what offsets they're using and how they're using it, and what percentage of their certain figures are based on offsets. So I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad to use offsets. I think the important part is transparency and how much you're relying on them. And then thinking about a plan to not rely on them as much, to actually change your operations in a way where you're really reducing emissions and really, in your own operations, whether it's your scope 1 or your value chain in scope 2 and 3, how you're actually thinking about reducing that carbon footprint over time.
Thank you. And the last question is to Ms. Prada. Are there any venture capital structures where the citizens across Latin America and Caribbean get to invest as well and benefit from the creative economy?
If there are any, what was
investment structures
Oh.
that the citizens of Latin America or the Caribbean can invest in and benefit alongside IDB?
There are currently no investment structures. That's why we're presenting as an opportunity, but there is no formal investment structure whatsoever. No, we're currently working with governments to bring all this information into their knowledge so that they can invest, the public sector can invest into the creative economy. And no, there's just one case in the whole Latin America. There's one case, the Screen Capital Fund that I shared, which is private for the audiovisual sector, but we lack the structure for investment in the creative cultural industry, especially the private sector.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you. And we do have time for one more question, if anyone on the floor. Hey.
Good morning, everyone. My name is, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good. I'm glad to see all are laughing. That is great. That means I have your attention. My name is Drew, and I have volunteered here today. Now, I know people will be volunteer asking a question. Yes, I am asking a question. I am in the process of becoming an entrepreneur, and I have 2 running businesses right now. And I have a question for actually every panel member or speaker. So, Ryan, since you are the first, I would like to know, so a little backstory about my first company. I am a Russian manicurist. Now that term alone is very new in Barbados itself. Now, shifting gears, I am thinking about creating a product. I don't want to say what the product is yet, but to be a part of the sustainability process, I would like to know if, because there's packaging for this product, would you be using sea glass? Now this is sea glass that you find like literally on the beach. Would that be a good idea to package this product, but it would be like, it's a liquid. So would that be a good way to package this product? And the second question for you, with my second business, I am a baker. And would it be better to start, I have started doing it, but I want to invest more in locally grown and produced products. What advice would you give someone like me who is not only looking to build something, a legacy for their generation, because I have a 6-year-old, I know, right? And so I want to be, for the lack of a better word, part of that 1% that not only creates, but gives back. So basically, my simple question is, would it be a good, sustainable move to use the sea glass and to invest in more locally produced products for the food part of it?
What is sea glass? Sorry.
Oh, sea glass is basically, you know how you would have like broken glass on the beach?
Oh, got it.
Right.
Yeah, got it. Well, I think that's an excellent example of a circular economy model. I mean, obviously these are not outputs from your own business, but you're using recycled products as inputs. I think that there's a number of benefits there from a sustainability perspective. Obviously, you're using products, you're not creating anything new by, I mean, depending on the process, actually. So there's a lot of things to think about. If it depends on how you're producing and, you know, actually processing that sea glass in a number of ways. If the emissions profile is very intensive, I'm not sure what technology would be involved. I think you should examine the full life chain or life cycle of what your product would look like, and every single part that you're going to have to develop to package your product, to make the product itself, to distribute your product, to transport your product. These are all things that you have to think about when you're thinking about making a sustainability or a more sustainable business model. It's amazing to use recycled products, but some recycled products actually emit more just when you have to process them and actually turn them into some sort of, you know, packageable product or some sort of material to use for packaging, for example. So I'm not an expert on sea glass, unfortunately. It sounds really cool. I might buy it myself. But I think, you know, it's not as easy always as like, oh, I'm just going to find some stuff and make something because it's recycled and there we go. I think that's a huge marketing advantage if you do that. You should definitely communicate that into your marketing. But, you know, there are a lot more complex components to think about when you're creating a sustainable business model. I think sourcing locally grown products is also an excellent example of something that would be a sustainable practice. But once again, you know, thinking about the full spectrum of impact. So who are the people that produce that crop or actually work in that sector? Are they mostly women? Are they, is there any like gender imbalances? Are they being paid adequately? I think there's a lot of social perspectives as well that you can start to examine and think about from a sustainability lens when you're trying to source certain products as well. How far does it have to travel? If it's locally grown in Barbados, it doesn't sound like it's going very far, which is great. But then who is your target market after that? I think, once again, these are all like great marketing points that should definitely be communicated. But if you're going to be, mostly exporting to Thailand or, I don't know, just a random example, or India, then there are emissions that are associated with the transport of your product across the globe as well. So then how are you getting things there? And then even locally, when you're thinking about that product, how are you extracting it? What's the extraction process? Sometimes just extracting products or growing certain crops actually accumulate a large number of carbon emissions as well. I know people talk a lot about the methane that comes from beef, for example, when we're actually harvesting, beef from cows and cattle. That's a great example just from like an animal livestock perspective, but there are also crops that are super carbon intensive that we rely on a day-to-day basis, not only for its growth, for the fertilizer that goes into it, but to transport all of those things. So if your factories are going to be set up locally as well, and the distance between each step of getting the product to the factory, into the product, the final product phase, and then like delivered to consumers, those are all things that have to be mapped out. I think, these are also really important considerations the larger companies grow. For smaller companies, it is important, like everyone has to do their part, but the majority of impact that companies have in the world are from large global corporations. They hold up the majority, the vast majority. The top companies alone in the world hold the vast majority of carbon emissions. And then by sector, if you just look at the oil and gas sector or certain other sectors, there's a large accumulations there. So I think doing the best you can as a small company to get started, and these small things really help in thinking about mapping out your full value chain and process. But then as you grow, it will be more important to think about all of the sustainability aspects rather than wearing yourself down in the beginning. That would be my personal perspective.
If I can add to what Ryan just said, even though the C-Class project doesn't seem to be from the creative economy per se, but I would say that whatever, if you can protect your creativity, right, to kind of understand what the patents, licenses are from Barbados, and protect it with under IP rights. I think it would be a wise thing to do.
Thank you so much, Ileana. And this question is actually ready for you, because really and truly there are not a lot of standards pertaining to I am in the beauty industry as well, and I think that does count as the creative economy, correct?
Can you repeat the question? I can barely understand.
I am in the right. I am in the beauty industry, and my first question is, does that count as being part of the creative economy? And there is not a lot of standards in our economy right now, unfortunately, when it comes to the beauty industry. So
beauty, you said the beauty?
The beauty industry. Okay. So how would I go about implementing those standards per se, or even creating a framework for a standardized process here within the beauty industries, specifically when it comes to, for the broader term, being a nail technician?
I don't know the beauty industry, to be honest with you.
Okay, that is okay.
If you want, we can talk afterwards and try to understand a little bit better what you're telling me, because if I don't.
Okay, that is fantastic. I will get a little more into detail. And for Miss Amy Fletcher, I would like to know, when it comes to finance, for a small business, it is really difficult, especially when you do not have large targets or even bottom lines. How would me or my company go about trying to create even some small framework to be able to start sitting at that investor or investment table?
As someone who made the decision to shift from academia, which I did love, but it was time for a change, and I've moved into the entrepreneurial space, I've probably made every mistake that it's possible to make. So I'm speaking both from my own experience and then also my personal view, which is informed by the work I do in Foresight. I'm not sure where you are in the process, but my take on what you're asking is before outside investors are even consulted, I think for both you as an entrepreneur and for your company, it's get very clear on what your product is, what your non-negotiables are, and what your values are. In other words, you've asked about sustainability. Well, we all have a tension between doing well and doing good. We all want to make money. We want our products to be successful. We want to hire other people, and that's a great thing. I'm not negative about that necessarily. But I think as a young, new entrepreneur, it's very easy to move so far down the path in your mind that some of the essentials, you just need to be, again, very clear. What is your price point? Who are you doing this for? What are the non-negotiables? If someone comes to you and says, I can do this cheaper and we can get this product out there, it's going to be a little dodgy relative to this other option on some of the sustainability questions, but it's legal. It's just not optimal. Where do you draw the line there? So again, I think your values, I don't just mean your mission statement. I mean your values. Why are you doing this? For yourself, for your community, for your workers, for Barbados, for your, region, and only you can know that. What are your non-negotiables, and what is the point of this product? What does it bring that's new or different or culturally informed to a world that's saturated with products? And I think if those three things are in place from my personal experience, that tends to make some of the deeper, more technical questions about funding and sustainability and reporting and investors, I think you're on firmer ground when you start bringing in other people, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you so much to each of you here today. You were very engaged, I have to say. We got a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we weren't able to get to them all, but I am sure you can connect with our speakers afterwards if you want to do a more deep dive. And also a special thank you to our speakers, our thought leaders, for having that exchange with our attendees today. And we truly appreciate it, and you made it very, very impactful. I'll ask you to remain seated on stage as we invite Ms. Rashada Lopez, Treasurer of the CFA Society Barbados, to present each of you a small token of appreciation. As we bring today's event to a close, please welcome back the President of CFA Society Barbados, Mr. Anderson Skeet, to deliver our vote of thanks.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we bring the formal presentations of our annual forecast event to a close, I am filled with immense optimism for the future of our financial sector. Today, we stood at the crossroads of creativity, credibility, and capital. Thanks to our speakers, we now leave with a practical roadmap for the journey ahead. My profound thanks go to our three extraordinary presenters, Dr. Amy Fletcher, for anchoring our technological future in a strong framework of AI ethics, Mr. Ryan Ballard, for showing us how to turn sustainability metrics into tangible corporate value, Ms. Elenian Prada, for illustrating the immense unlockable economic potential within our region's creative orange economy. I also want to extend our deepest appreciation to our CFA Board of Directors. Firstly, Ms. Lynn Wright, our admin assistant, otherwise known as the backbone of the CFA Society. Our lovely and gracious host, Mrs. Makila Alibox, Ms. Alicia Sobers, who unfortunately could not be here today as she is overseas on work abroad. Mr. Brazin Bess, our Vice President, thank you for your continued support. Ms. Rashada Lopez, for leading our presentation of gifts. To our steadfast sponsors, CIBC Caribbean, Ernst & Young, the National Financial Literacy Program, Cido Bank and Trust, and Courtesy Garage, thank you for your continuous investment in regional thought leadership. Our appreciation also goes to the Hilton Hotel team for their exceptional hospitality this morning and this afternoon. Most importantly, thank you, our members and friends of the CFA Society Barbados. Your engaging questions and dedication to our market's integrity are what drive this community forward. Let us carry these insights back to our respective firms and continue turning this creative capital into credible growth. Please join us now as we transition to the final act of the forecast event, lunch. Lunch will be served on the outside, offering a perfect opportunity to network and continue these vital discussions. Thank you, travel safely, and do enjoy your lunch. All right, I guess everyone could assemble.